This Hangout on Air is live. Okay, we are live. Are you good? Are you there, Zach? Because I can't hear you anymore. I can't hear you anymore, Zach. I wonder if your voice recorder app disables your audio coming here, maybe? Oh, you left the chat.
Hello?
Oh, there, I gotcha.
I think, hang on. I think if I have my recorder on,
It destroys it, hey?
yeah.
Okay, well, I guess we'll have to scrap that idea.
Let's just roll with it and see where it goes.
Yep.
All
Let's
right.
do it.
All right.
Yeah.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Dear listeners, welcome to the inaugural episode of the Forgotten Reformation, where we discuss the lesser-known elements of Reformation history and theology. I am JC, and we got our co-host here.
Zach, yeah, I'm the co-host.
I guess I'm the co-host as well. We are doing this together, Zach and I. We've are recent friends, and we are here trying to test out a podcast on what we think and hope will be a very helpful set of topics.
Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do, and we're hoping and praying that the Lord will bless that. So, kind of our overview is that we hope to address lesser known events within Reformed theological history and apply those events today, and in turn offer to people an easy resource to access some of the lesser known controversies and issues of the past, as well as some of the things that the Lord has done in building up his church, not only simply controversy, but as well as revival and reformation. So all of those things we are very excited to bring to you, and we hope that this sort of test run, this pilot episode, if you will go particularly well.
Yeah, that's quite wonderful. Zach, do you want to tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you're up to in life?
Yeah, I am a student at Westminster Seminary in the beautiful city of Philadelphia, and I am a member of the Springford Restored Reformed congregation. And yeah, I'm enjoying life in my mid-20s. I'm studying all the time, reading a lot of Bavinck, a lot of Francis Turretin, as we'll discuss later, and we'll also discuss his son. And yeah, that's really kind of who I am. JC, you want to tell them something more about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a member here at Faith Vancouver Presbyterian Church in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. So this is a bit of an international podcast here. Zach from the States, me from the Great White North. I'm an accountant, also mid-20s, and I think it's fun here that we got a bit of also the continental divide. Zach from the Dutch Reformed tradition, and myself currently in a Presbyterian church. And one thing I like about Zach here is bringing in that Dutch Reformed continental flavor, because And I think largely it's due to a language barrier that a lot of us get trapped in Great Britain, just reading writers that wrote in English. So I think we're missing out on a pretty bright Reformation history that's a lot broader than just the English-speaking world.
And I would totally agree with that. And I think actually one of the great tragedies is many of these writers are accessible. A figure that we're going to talk about today, Benedict Pictet, for example, he has a systematic theology translated into English. It's just out of print. So in order to have access to many of these things, you have to do a bit of looking around on the internet and so on. And I think that's certainly a disappointment. But we also have, I think, things like the Junius Institute, the Dutch Translation Society up in Grand Rapids, several denominational committees from Dutch Reformed churches, as well as, other groups of people that are interested in trying to translate a lot of this continental work and get it back into the hands of the people. So I think we can, all be tremendously excited about that. Not to mention that there has been a great deal, just kind of overlooking the Continental Reformation. There has been a great deal of secular scholarship done, as well as in the 1800s there was a great deal of actual church scholarship done with men like Merle d'Albania, and then also I think it was J.I. Good of the German Reformed Church, RCUS, here in the States, wrote a number of histories. So I think this stuff is fairly accessible, but in large measure forgotten. And then what is forgotten that hasn't, or what has been forgotten, what's not accessible, what hasn't been translated will not be translated. And what has been, in print in English will not be put back into print because there's simply no demand for that. So we are hopeful that this will kind of, make people desire to have kind of Reformation and post Reformation resources available to themselves.
Oh, totally. And it's really wonderful that we are starting to get even still new translations of a lot of these works are coming out. Like, yeah, even the stuff Reformation Heritage Books has been putting out, that new set of Vandergrohe sermons on the Heidelberg Catechism. And I myself have been greatly profiting this year from reading Willimus of Brockel's The Christian's Reasonable Service, which was translated into English in the mid-90s. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about that is just how easy it is to read. And as much as we love reading the Puritans, I know for myself, I can find it quite difficult at times with just the older language and following the sentence structure. But with some of these continental works that are just getting translated into English, they read like modern English. And so it makes it really accessible for those like me that aren't as steeped in all these historic works like Zach here is.
Oh, I don't know if it's necessarily fair to call myself steeped in the historic works. I certainly probably have read a little bit of everybody, far more than I've read a lot of one. But I am very, very excited about things that are excited that we have so many things accessible here to us, and I think it's a particular.
Was your voice cutting out in your ears there? Because it was glitching a bit on my side. Are you there, Zach? Are you there? Are you there, Zach?
Are we good?
That was the first thing I heard of you.
Well, I haven't been saying anything to my defense, so.
Okay, yeah, because I can we can take breaks if we need to, because I can edit it out by extracting the audio pretty easily, so don't have to worry about that.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so yeah. What was it cutting out
Go
in your
ahead.
ears though at all?
You were cutting out just now. I think that was on my end though, and it looks like it's been resolved.
Okay. Do you just want to say that last like 2 or 3 sentences you were saying, and then we'll continue?
Um, I'm very thankful that a lot of continental works have been put back into print and are being translated, and I think these are all very good things, and I think that they are very kind of healthy things for the life of the church. And I think that in a sense, the Reformed world has really and ultimately, I think, to its own kind of destruction. We kind of are all about Calvin, and then we skip off of Calvin to the Puritans, and then from the Puritans to Spurgeon, and then now today to the latest and greatest. And we've actually our amount of our theological heritage, and that's something that I think desperately needs to be recovered. So I do look forward to that.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to be about a little bit as a podcast here, trying to bring to light not only some of the works of theologians that might be lesser well known, but also a lot of the great stories of Reformation history that we don't hear about, like, for instance, the Hungarian Reformation or the Swiss Reformation. There's a lot of these wonderful works of God that we haven't heard of, wonderful men of God who many people haven't read. Not to mention many wonderful Reformed doctrines that have been lost in the church today. And as much as we appreciate the recovery of a lot of Reformed theology that is prominent in the church, we think there's a lot more pieces that we could be exposed to and have our eyes opened to that could be a real blessing to the Church of Christ.
Yeah, I entirely agree, and I look forward to seeing what the Lord will do with this, and I look being able hopefully to articulate kind of.
You were cutting out there for me.
I said I look forward to articulate interesting stuff for people out there and try to provide a better backdrop of history.
Wonderful. Well, why don't we get into today's topic then?
Let's do it.
Okay, so we are talking about how Turretin's son ruined Geneva.
Which is quite a I guess a catchy thing, right? I mean, that's really I guess a positive, exciting thing, because everybody thinks Turretin's son. Nobody's heard of him, and here we are going to be talking about him. So I'm excited about this.
Yeah, we were talking with some friends a couple weeks back, and Zach mentioned how Turretin's son ruined Geneva, and it became a bit of a saying among us that Turretin's son did indeed ruin Geneva. And it actually it's quite a fascinating history when you look into it. So when Zach and I were discussing what to do for our first episode, we figured, why not tell everybody how Turretin's son ruined Geneva?
So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, so by way of background, Zach, do you want to just tell us a little bit about Geneva? Take us up to the point where Turretin's son ruined it.
So I think perhaps we of course we have that kind of joke in and amongst ourselves, JC, where Turretin's son ruined Geneva. I think that's perhaps not the best statement. It's a little dishonest because Turretin's son really ruined all of Switzerland with it. I think we should probably become aware that Geneva, of course, was where Calvin led kind of the legendary Reformation. It was really the bastion of Reformed doctrine. It sent out numerous preachers. I think the farthest they reached was Brazil. They sent out missionaries to everywhere. There was correspondence from Geneva going out to all corners of Europe, speaking about the Reformation doctrines. And I think that we can look back upon this with a great deal of fondness. And I think in looking back upon this, we kind of forget Switzerland. I was actually just thinking about this earlier today, and I thought, well, I kind of, in my own mind, myself, have divorced Geneva from Switzerland itself. But I would say that that's probably not, the best thing that you could do. So what brings us to this point in kind of the immediate context is Turretin's son kind of rises to prominence in the early 1700s.
Actually, Jack, why don't we tell people first who Turretin is in case they don't know?
Oh, of course, of course. So Francis Turretin um, is sort of seen as one of the high points of continental orthodoxy. Francis Turretin definitely is a figure, well above anyone today, really, I would almost say, in intellect and power and so on. Of course, his institutes have been in print now for as long as I know in the English language. They're published by P&R Publishing, and here at Westminster, I can happily say that they are one of the systematics that we use in teaching systematics. Now, Francis Turretin himself was really one of the, shall we say, a high figure of the post-Reformation era. And what I mean by that is Francis Turretin was kind of the embodiment of Reformed scholasticism. He was a scholar, very academic, a very able preacher, capable really in every way. And Turretin, just to give you kind of a little background on him, he would be born in October of 1623, and the Lord would take him to glory in September of 1687. So for those days, I think it's safe to say he lived a full life, and even today he would have lived a very full life. He was the grandson of a man named Francisco Turretini, whom he would be named after, who relocated to Geneva in 1592 from Italy. And Francis Turretin would really kind of become, if you will, the ultimate figure of Reformed scholasticism. And to kind of give an idea of what Reformed scholasticism is, it's an academic theology that was using logical and scholastic methods in order to convey the truths of the Bible. Now, some people have leveled at Reformed scholasticism, I think, this very false idea that, Calvin and Luther and others were very much interested in exegesis. They were interested in the Bible, and the Reformed scholastics brought philosophy into it. I would vehemently disagree with this, and I would say that the Reformed scholastics were really continuing on in the tradition of Calvin and the other reformers. And I think that the early reformers were deeply influenced by kind of a scholastic streak, and that later Reformed scholasticism matched the early reformers in a biblical understanding of things and in a usage of theology from the Bible. I think that the thing is they were particularly interested in presenting things scholastically. They were interested in philosophy and logic as means of apologetics, as means of organizing information, as all sorts of things. And so, in um, his institutes, really he personified Reformed scholasticism for many of us. And that's not to say there's not other works that were used by the Reformed Church in this period. There were numerous other works, including a rather large work by a man named Paulinus, who maybe one day we could talk about in this podcast. But anyway, I think the important thing to emphasize is that Francis Turretin is the height of this wonderful high point of the use of theology from the Bible, coupled with a scholastic really academic, really logical presentation of that, as well as a philosophical underpinning, and that philosophical underpinning in large measure would have been taken from people like Aristotle and Aquinas, and there would later be some forays by others, not Turretin himself, into a system called Ramism and so on. But
Yeah, and perhaps we could discuss, more of Reformed scholasticism in a future episode, because it has kind of been downtrodden, as you've said, and fallen into disrepute. And if people do want to study more on it, Zach, would you agree that probably the best person to look to is Richard Muller and his works
yeah, I
on
would
it?
say I was actually, Richard Muller. I've got a volume of his dogmatics sitting here. I was going to read a quote out of it or a quote from Muller about Jean-Alphonse Turretin, who we'll be discussing today.
Oh,
But
wonderful.
I would say, now they're hard to get a hold of. I actually have mine on loan from a friend of mine, and I was told to have it back by Wednesday because,
Wow.
yeah, they're in high demand. But hopefully these things will be put back into print. It's a 4-volume set, and Richard Muller actually, I think, quite wonderfully sets out to vindicate Reformed scholasticism and the theology of the post-Reformation. And so I would say that's definitely a place to look. But I would also say, these volumes are expensive; they're out of print. Um, Perhaps we could link them to places like the Junius Institute and others that would provide brief overviews in video lectures, and those things are certainly exciting as well. So
Totally.
those are good resources available on Reformed scholasticism.
Awesome. So lots for the listeners to look into if they wish. It's a whole world out there worth exploring. But let's get on to telling them more about Francis Turretin's son and Geneva.
So I think we're gonna have to take a quick step back actually to Turretin, and Francis would have been alive at this point certainly, but Turretin is developing this really scholastic, very logical, and honestly, I think you could be fair to say by standards of today, somewhat isolationist or somewhat. I'm trying to think of a good word to use here. A theology that's perhaps more nitpicky than many would like today. And
Precisionist.
what was that? Sorry.
I was thinking people often called these picky Dutch people precisionists, and that might be an applicable term here.
I think Francis Turton was a precisionist, and I think that in turn, Francis Turretin's theology, if you read his Institutes, is incredibly precise. And so to draw back on that, there was at the in the late 1600s through the beginning of the 1700s, there was quite an issue with the theology of a place called Saumur, which was a theological school in France. If memory serves correctly, one of two places that ministers in the Huguenot or French Reformed Church could be trained. A number of these professors kind of pioneered a bit of a more liberal theology. So Saumur was actually founded by a man named Duplessis Mornay. Would kind of in the mid 1600s begin to develop itself into a more liberal school of thought with men like Josue de la Pace, who his dates were 1596 to 1655. You would have Louis Capel from 1585 to 1658, and I think perhaps most notably Moïse Amaralt, or Moses Amaraldius in Latin, if that's ringing a bell. Of course, everybody's bell goes off when they hear Amaralt or Amaraldius.
Right.
Um, and he was from 1596 to 1664. Um, and so basically, these men kind of attacked subtly the Reformed orthodoxy of the Reformed Church in France. And in doing so, they caused a lot of spillover into Geneva. And as persecution arose in France, preachers from France would come to Geneva in order to seek refuge, and they would, obviously be seeking churches. And when this happened, and I believe it was particularly when the Edict of Nantes was revoked. Yes, when it was revoked, then there was a flood of these guys coming into Geneva, and the the edict was revoked, by the way, in 1685. But when the act was revoked, so in 1685, you had a flood of French preachers coming, and some of them were Amyraldians. They had really a wide variety of sketchy theology, and there's three main points that the theology of Samour kind of went outside the bounds of Reformed orthodoxy. Louis Capel, one of the scholars I mentioned earlier, he undercut verbal inspiration. And we probably don't have time to go into all the particulars, but Moses Amaral, he undercut universal, he introduced the idea of a universal atonement and undercut predestination, election, and limited atonement.
Right, and that would be where you'd have today people that would call themselves 4-point Calvinists. They'd historically be called Amyraldians, from this guy dropping that limited atonement point in the original formulation.
Right, that's right. And then the last place where the Academy at Samour really, I think, kind of went a little strange was they had a strange view on imputation. And actually, the Helvetic consensus is kind of the main document in question here.
Now, is that the same as the Helvetic Confession or Second Helvetic
No,
Confession? Okay.
No, they are two. So I should probably explain this. The Helvetic Confession is a much earlier document, and the second the second Helvetic Confession, also earlier document, and the Helvetic consensus formula was composed in 1675, and it was composed primarily by three men. And those three men would be Francis Turretin, Lucas Grenler of Basel, and John Henry Heidegger of Zurich. Okay, and these three men composed this formula primarily to deal with the bad theology that was coming out of Samour. And it was put in place before the I guess surge in of these French ministers after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. But this formula of consensus was a very scholastic statement. It really detailed a lot of things, and it was, again, I emphasize, it was designed really to guard proper Calvinist doctrine. And actually, it was designed to be a defense of what was already laid out in the canons of Dort. And it was really designed to fight Amyraldus more than the other two men which I mentioned. And so this formula has been called formula anti-Samourianus or anti-Amyraldensis. So it was against the theology of Samour and theology of Amyrald. And a lot of people struggled with this formula. They felt that it was really too scholastic, and it did point to a very high form of Calvinism, and some people felt that it was really unfair that it did this, and it was quite strong, for example, on limited atonement. So there was, I think, from the beginning when this was actually put into place, there was quite a bit of resistance to it, truthfully, and so therefore, I think it's important that we bear in mind that certainly these things, um, every confession, this is how I want to phrase it, every confession rises out of a need for the church typically to deal with error. And Samur had brought error in. And so now we're going to jump into Jean-Alphonse Turretin. Jean-Alphonse Turretin actually had come into contact with the theology of Samur when a man named Jean-Robert Chouet had introduced Cartesian philosophy at the Academy of Samur, and then had gone and taught at Geneva. And Jean-Alphonse studied under a man named Louis Tronchin, who, if I remember correctly, was a student of Chaussette. And so anyway, and there's a lot of names here, and things can somewhat be confusing, especially when you're comparing a lot of sources. And maybe I should have mentioned that from the get-go. I'm basically, when every one of these things, what I'm doing is I'm looking in different books of general histories of the Reformed Church. I'm looking to see if I can find PhD thesis. I'm looking to see in scholarly journals what I can find that indicates a lot of this stuff. So I hope I'm not being too sketchy, and I hope I'm not getting names mixed up, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to keep this all in line. But anyway, Jean-Alphonse studied under Louis Tronchin, and Louis Tronchin was an advocate of the theology of Samur, and he opposed his father, Francis Turretin, on a number of issues, the main one being the Helvetic formula consensus.
So you're saying that right here we have Francis Turretin's son gaining an influence from the types of teachers that his father would definitely disagree with, probably against his father's wishes, inquiring into this new theology, this more liberal theology, and it leads him to really almost a divide in the family, in that he sides with this more liberal side than his father's historic conservative views.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting because these two men I mentioned, Jean-Robert Chaussette and Louis Tronchin, they both came and taught theology in Geneva with Samurian views. So Jean-Alphonse Turretin, studying under these men, I think his father would have known some of these influences on his son, although I certainly can't prove that. And I think his father would have been well aware that these two tutors were training his son as well as other men in Switzerland in the Samurian theology. And that's actually one of the reasons why we do have the consensus that was published, was because they saw this Samurian theology as a growing threat. So anyway, Francis Turretin's son, despite whatever bad theological training and leanings he had, he would become pastor of the Italian congregation in Geneva in 1693, and he would be named a professor of church history at the Academy in 1697, and then he would become rector in 1701, and finally, I believe it was after the passing of Benedict Pictet that he would become professor of theology. And his father, of course, is the architect of this very scholastic confession, the Helvetic formula consensus. And his son, once Benedict Pictet is gone, which Benedict Pictet, by the way, is one of the last he's the last really Orthodox Genevan from the line of Calvin. So you have Calvin on down through Beza, then Turretin, and Pictet. And Pictet's really the last great theologian of Geneva. And then with Pictet, it's pretty well done because Jean-Alphonse Turretin, or Turretin's son, as he's so well known, I think, kind of took over from his death.
And do we have works by Pictet that have been translated? He has a systematic theology, right?
Yes, there is a systematic theology, and if you were just to Google Pictet's theology, you would find it on archive.org. I appreciate Pictet's theology. I find it's a rather short systematic, and I find it to be a very, very good systematic theology in the regard that it offers short answers when you need them. And by the way, another interesting kind of dynamic to this with Turretin, Francis Turretin, Jean-Alphonse Turretin, and Benedict Pictet is Benedict Pictet is actually the nephew of Francis Turretin. So he would have been, I believe, a cousin of Jean-Alphonse, although some years older. And therefore, there's a very unique kind of family element to what's going on here in Geneva. In that everybody who's really feuding, they're all related. So anyway, kind of going on from that.
Imagine being there for a family meal.
Yeah. Well,
nice Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, I don't know that they would have been, doing that sort of stuff necessarily, but it is interesting that there is kind of a relation there. So
and it does,
anyway,
interestingly enough, I think historically we do often see that it actually is in the families directly where apostasy comes or just declension comes, as children seem prone to rebel against the ideas and values of their parents. It's that sad state. We see it in the Bible again and again. A generation that holds to truth and the next one wanders away.
Yeah, no, and I think you can see it here clearly. I think that as you're watching this kind of tale unfold of Jean-Alphonse Turretin, I think it's somewhat shall we say difficult for people to process. And the reason I say that is because you can imagine this guy, Francis Turretin, he was really the height of Reformed Orthodoxy. And certainly today, he's a very common systematic theology. He's still used at Westminster. I don't know if they're using him at other seminaries, but he was used at Princeton, I believe, from its inception until Hodge published his systematic. So Turretin has really a long history, a very, I think, good history, and certainly he is a theologian par excellence. But
which makes it all the more significant that it was his very own son, this man who was the height of Reformed Orthodoxy in this period, that it was just the very next generation where we start to see declension.
Yeah, so actually, I'm glad you brought that up, and now I would kind of like to introduce a quote by none other than Richard Muller. And this is a bit of a long quote, but I think it helps us kind of gain ground of where we are. And this is from his fourth volume, The Triunity of God, in his Post-Reformation Dogmatics, and it's taken from page 120. And what he says is, of course, there was a decline in doctrine, and we've discussed some of this stuff coming out of Samur, and I hope here in a moment to really go into more of Francis Turretin's son's mind on why he desired to depart from the Helvetic consensus. But I do want to read this, and I think it kind of sets the stage quite well. Muller says some nominally orthodox writers drew upon the new philosophies for the sake of developing and defending traditional theism, while others turned away from the traditional alliance of theology and philosophy and attempted to develop theological systems and doctrinal statements without any overt recourse to a philosophical perspective. The result of their efforts was either the maintenance of orthodox teaching without its traditional exegetical and philosophical underpinnings, or a development of doctrine away from traditional norms. The former model is apparent in the so-called transitional or latitudinarian theologies of J.A. Turretin, Oosterwald, and Burnet, in which the orthodoxy of the writer is occasionally open to question. And then he goes on to talk about how other writers, like John Gill, for example, would try to remove the alliance between philosophy and theology. Of course, Luther says philosophy is the handmaid of theology. So, I think philosophy has a key role. But what you're basically seeing Muller just say in that quote is, and I should have brought this out more clearly, but this is the rise of the Enlightenment at the end of the 17th century, going into the 18th century, and we are seeing more Enlightenment principles, and man's reason is being conflated. And because man's reason is being conflated, it would appear that men like J.A. Turretin would have felt that, well, he did feel, I have read quite extensively on what he exactly thought, and he did feel that man's reason was kind of the end all be all, so to speak, and therefore it drove him away from an exegetical theology. And I think this is one of the great tragedies of kind of the post-Reformation era. Was you have the Reformation with all these giants, you have the post-Reformation where really a very good theology is being finely tuned, and then you have it all just tumbling down in a generation with men like Jean-Alphonse Turretin.
So are you saying that Jean-Alphonse Turretin, he did not want to hold to some of the philosophical underpinnings that Francis Turretin did, and wanted it to be more purely exegetical, but at the same time relying on just reason?
No. Jean-Alphonse Turretin wanted more philosophy and less exegesis.
Whereas
like
Francis
Muller,
Turretin was a more of a beautiful marriage between philosophy and exegesis, correct?
Yeah, I think that's what Muller would say about the whole post-Reformation era in his Reformed Dogmatics. Is he would say that there was a beautiful marriage between sound exegesis and philosophy and logic and reasoning in delivering these things. And Jean-Alphonse Turretin is going to be kind of the first generation to look more to reason than to exegesis. That would be what I basically would argue. And so when you mentioned wanting to move away from philosophy to just exegesis, I think Muller levels that charge more at someone like John Gill.
Right. Which makes sense, seeing as he's a Baptist, and that's much more of a Baptistic perspective in general.
Well, I want to be careful with these kind of statements, because I think there's a lot of good things that the Baptists do offer, and certainly I think certainly the thing you have with the Baptists is, and I would be willing to say this, is they have not seemed to have the same scholastic underpinning, which, shall we say, the more properly Reformed, i.e. Swiss Reformed, Scottish Presbyterians, Dutch Reformed, have had. So I think that's a bit of a disappointment, and that move, according to Muller, is really kind of, it's Gill who's doing that. But let's not, I guess, dwell on John Gill so much, and let's
but it is it's a really interesting point of application, though, because there is this tension or balance in all the theology we do, that of course the Bible is a foundation and we have to hold it as our highest authority, but when we divorce it from other forms of philosophy and we isolate the Bible, we can get led to error even in that way, because God has designed his revelation that it accords with all truth. And it is a wonderful marriage we see there, but we see the liberal side moving towards just purely man's philosophy and man's reason at the expense of Scripture. But we also don't want to err on the side of just, it's me and my Bible and I can figure it out all on my own with my own mind here in my living room.
Right. And so I would agree with that. And I think that is an interesting point. And it's something that is, I think, to be lamented. As we look back upon the history of the church, with the elevation of reason, it is certainly to be lamented that was the case. Of course, it underscores really, I think, depravity, doctrine of total depravity, and it underscores the need for a sound exegesis and a sound exegetical theology, if you will. And it even underscores systematic theology, because they're going to move away from, systematizing the doctrines of the scriptures and really trying to build upon these things to building upon basically, the essentials. And Jean-Alphonse Turretin would sadly come out and say the essentials of the Christian faith are actually can be in large measure deduced by some reason. And I think that is a real tragedy. And I do, think it's really a phenomenal thought when we examine this in light of God's working with sinners, and we think of just how our depravity is to such an extent that one great fire burning for the Lord, so to speak, as what was happening in Geneva at the time before Jean-Alphonse Turretin could really be in large measure put out, doused out within a generation. It would only get worse from there.
Yeah. And we see it so clearly today. It's like man is naturally against God's law and doesn't submit to it. And there's such an elevation of our reason that, so many people today, if the Bible doesn't make sense to them, God's commands doesn't seem to accord with our cultural and high societal standards, that people think we're able to cast off God's law based on our reason and our wonderful state of knowledge that we've attained, which is really just, it's a rebellion against God's word and God's law, and it is to be lamented, as you said.
And yeah, I agree with that. Although I think the philosophical trends of our age are certainly interesting, but I think one of the things that and we can take away from Jean-Alphonse Turretin is that we have to be careful, we have to guard ourselves. And no matter what the trends of the day are, we have to be careful. Of course, the scriptures say there's nothing new under the sun. And Jude, he speaks of, uses the wonderful language of men crept in unawares. And
right.
And certainly Jean-Alphonse Turretin would have crept in a sense, unawares. I don't think that the church was entirely. I think there was a great deal of struggle in Geneva over the issues of this new Enlightenment theology slash and what men like J.H. Heidegger and Francis Turretin wanted them to hold to. So it would actually be after the death of Benedict Pictet, sadly, a year after. I believe he died in 1705, that in 1706, the Helvetic formula consensus would be, done away with in most of the Swiss cantons. And that's, to draw back earlier, why I said it's a shame that we don't see Switzerland in its full context, is because it was not only Switzerland is organized into cantons, and they're kind of like counties, I suppose. I don't know, do you have counties in BC there, JC?
No, we have like cities and regions kind of, but yeah, I guess they're kind of like counties, but we don't use the term counties really.
Oh yeah. So as an American, the county is kind of a dear term to me, right? As a rural American, it becomes very dear to you because I am a rural American. You're known by your county because your towns really have no size. So anyway, these cantons, you can think of them like counties, and they're all sort of independently governing, and they kind of form a federation. And so every canton basically has its own kind of church infrastructure, and it would be in most of the cantons with the Helvetic consensus or Helvetic formula consensus going away. Only, I believe, in Zurich and one other canton was that formula preserved. Yeah, so it went away in 1706 from Basel, Geneva, and Neuchâtel. I think that's how you say it. Zurich and Bern retained it. And in Zurich, it was recognized until as late as 1741. And if memory serves anyway, that was the last canton to have it. So from 1675 to 1741 was as long as the formula consensus lasted.
So, and again, just to refresh the listener, this is the consensus that Francis Turton helped design that was orthodox and was originally held by all the cantons, pretty much?
Well, yeah, I would say it was the Swiss kind of reformed scene can be a little bit difficult to discern. I can speak for the following cantons: Zurich, Bern, Basel, Geneva, and Neuchâtel. They adopted it when it came out, and I believe in 1706 it went away in Geneva. In 1722, the King of Prussia requested that this creed be cast off, and it was subsequently cast off, I believe, in more cantons, but it did survive for the longest period in Zurich, and it lasted until 1640 or 1741 there.
So can you walk us through the process of how does J.A. Turretin basically start dismantling this consensus that is held in all these regions to the point where they start casting it aside?
Well, so I think the answer to that is, unfortunately, there was when that consensus was adopted, it was basically a firewall, and the problem is the wall went up, but the problem was already within the wall. So basically, what I mean by that is unfortunately, the shall we say, the consensus was adopted to deal with the theology of some more, particularly Amyraldianism, and that had already infiltrated Switzerland. Enlightenment ideas had already infiltrated Switzerland, and also an ecumenical idea, which I will go ahead and touch on now, is that the King of Prussia in 1722, he requested the Swiss churches drop it because he felt it was a hindrance to Christian unity. The Archbishop of Canterbury in England was writing to J.A. Turretin, and they were wanting a greater degree of Christian unity, and that's one of the things. So there really was a compromise of the truth, and in this compromising of the truth, there was a desire for greater Christian unity, but ultimately declension would be the outcome of that. And of course, we are grieved when this is the case. And so often you see, and I think this is an interesting parallel with liberalism in the late 1800s through the mid 1900s, we again saw this very impressive kind of desire for Christian unity, but it was accompanied by a real theological declension. And of course, it happened a few hundred years earlier with J.A. Turretin, son of Francis Turretin, kind of spearheading the charge in Switzerland, at least.
Right. So is his kind of involvement there is, they have this consensus and J.A. Turretin saying, no, like it's too strict, it's too exclusive. If we want to have unity, we need to kind of slacken the reins here and start opening the door to be more charitable and generous, to have more people in our fold.
So what J.A. Turretin, and this is kind of the deeper weeds of the stuff. Um, J.A. Turretin would want to eliminate this sort of creedal, very strict
Zach, I
religion.
think something might be. Does you have a piece of paper on your mic or something? Because your voice just got muffly.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, sorry. I think that the way to answer this would be, first off, the church was not, I think, entirely for this consensus when it came out. I think that probably people were somewhat apathetic to it. It didn't really matter. I think another thing that arose was kind of a Arminian view of Christian unity and an elevating of reason. So, and I really don't necessarily want to get into detail because this can be quite confusing. But basically, Jean-Alphonse Turretin would say, and he's getting this from, I think, in large measure, a guy named Isaac de Husseau, that reason can kind of determine what is our what is the doctrines that are common between all Protestants. So Turretin writes a book called The Cloud of Witnesses. And in this book, this is J.A. Turretin, Jean-Alphonse Turretin, writes a book called The Cloud of Witnesses. And in this tome, he sort of lays out several ways in which church unity can be achieved. Now, ultimately, Turton, very interestingly enough, is not successful in this. But basically, he's looking at things from a very reasonable standpoint. So he's saying, basically, what is immediately revealed in the Scripture, such as justification by faith alone, or other doctrines like Christ is the only way to God. He's the only mediator, the only savior. These sort of things, he's saying they're very self-evident, and therefore those sorts of things had ought to be what unifies us. And lesser doctrines like the formulation of God's decrees and election and predestination had ought not to divide us. And I think that's where he bumps up against this consensus. Is the consensus is very clear, and J.A. Turretin, he in a sense wants to be clear about what he perceives are reasonable things to be clear about. And ultimately, what's interesting is this line of thought actually comes from none other than the Arminians and from the Remonstrants and the Socinians. So all of this thought is coming from the Socinians, the Remonstrants, the Arminians, these sort of heretical / dodgy sects of Christianity, and they're infiltrating Reformed Christianity. And I think they would say, Jean-Alphonse Turretin would say, kind of our hope is we could have greater unity with the Lutherans and Anglicans and others by removing some of these things and basically allowing for essentials like the Trinity, salvation by Christ alone, justification by faith alone, these sorts of things to be what unifies us, and a great deal of what I would call latitudinarianism, which is what the term that Muller uses, in order to allow greater communion within churches and latitude on secondary issues.
Right, and I think that was, that really is my interest in this topic and why I thought it was so fitting, because it does direct us to this big overarching issue in our theology, and it is that idea of how strict ought we to be, how precise ought we to be in our formulations, because there is such a strong desire for Christian unity, and we do want to be unified. Christ himself prays that his church would be one, and I think all true believers do have this deep desire to be in unity with everyone else that loves Jesus Christ. And so I do think there's this ever-present temptation to loosen our theology, to be more and more inclusive. But the effect of that is declension, where we ultimately stop holding the truth, and truths start crumbling one by one, because every truth you remove makes a whole nother group of people that you can allow in. And this can be a very slippery slope to when, you say you have 10 essential truths and you're down to 2, and eventually the faith comes to mean nothing.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of, I guess, overall lesson, and maybe we could revisit this and do like a whole greater series on why Turretin is the way he is, because information, and it's, certainly I'm not opposed to being scholastic, and JC, you and I, we can talk about this later, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of stuff we could discuss, but the main point I would say is that Turretin's son is really kind of a sad culmination of a very godly heritage. Francis Turretin, of course, phenomenal theologian, as I've said probably 10 times on this podcast episode, coupled with, I think, kind of bad reasoning and different sort of motivations, different influences coming in. It leads to the crumbling of the Swiss Reformed Church, and that is really sad. And I think the lesson to take away is ultimately the Lord preserves us, and so the church, I think, to be preserved, must lean upon the Lord and must desire that the pure doctrine and whatever relations we have and so on, that's all given by the Lord, and it's reinforced by the Lord. Of course, I think true Christian unity comes from passages of Scripture like John 17, where Christ is drawing believers to himself, and I think we all have that unity in common. And I think that's really the root of unity is spiritual unity in Christ, regardless of ecclesiastical unions, but rather in the invisible church. So I think the ultimate thing that can be taken away here is just the need of fear and trembling when it comes to one handling these doctrines, when it comes to encountering this, and when it comes to dealing with many of these issues that came up. And it is a great, I think, shame that so much of what we hear today is towards an imbalanced or unbalanced unity. So I think we have a unity in Christ, but I am a little hesitant to compromise.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's the thing. We've grown up in our generation, Zach, you and I being young guys, we've, in a sense, grown up the children of Turretin's son, in that these foundations of Reformation orthodoxy have been crumbling for generations and generations, and to the point where, for me, growing up, even the term doctrine was almost considered a bad word. We didn't want doctrine. We didn't want to be picky or exclusive in all these different ways. And I myself, this is just even very personal to me, is that, when I first started discovering the doctrines of grace through men like Paul Washer and John Piper in 2008 and 2009, I became quite, cage stagey, as people would say. And I had run-ins with people and all such things. But then I ended up going through a phase for a few years where I became very interested in Christian and church unity, and I started, loosening up on things that I knew were true just for the sake of being able to include more and more people. And I went down that road, and it led me in a bad path towards liberalism myself, as I just started loosening up. But then I finally realized, by the Lord's grace, that true Christian unity has to be unity in the truth. And that great passage in Ephesians 4 that talks about how God's given the work of teachers for perfecting the saints, for the work of the ministry, for edifying of the body of Christ. till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we would henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and by cunning craftiness. And this is really the thing, that we are blown about as soon as we start loosening the reins too much, and we are carried away into error, and the church comes into a state of declension.
Yeah, so I would say, kind of on a deeply personal level, I grew up in the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, which is a very liberal church, right?
Your microphone sounds covered.
And in this very liberal environment in which I grew up, I think there was, in a sense, a great deal of kind of false unity. And I detected that after the Lord regenerated me. And it was one of the things that really kind of drove me away from that system, that liberal system, is I could find no peace there. And so I suppose that I went I started coming to more conservative convictions just because I realized it was all hogwash. But it was a deeply personal time for me, and now I'm probably very hesitant to compromise the truth. But going back to what you were touching on in Ephesians 4, and I think this is super important. You were talking of, I guess you began at what, verse 11 there, but just jumping to Ephesians 4 verse 15, but speaking the truth in love may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ Jesus. I think that kind of is the key. We need to speak the truth, and we need to do it lovingly and carefully and precisely, but ultimately, I think that speaking of the truth in love will do more to lead to true Christian unity and true fellowship, and to grow in Christ, as the apostle's speaking of there, than anything else.
Right, and that's so wonderful, that the compromise is not that we compromise the truth in the name of love. And the error in our circles, more on the Reform side, is to speak the truth and not in love. And so, the biblical answer is to speak the truth, these truths that we have attained through God's Spirit sanctifying his church in history, these wonderful Reformation truths that we want to keep discussing, is that we've got to share them in love. And it is a pity that there is this whole idea of, a cage stage Calvinist or cage stage Reformed people that attain to these new truths and understand them and are overjoyed, but yet fail to have the Christian maturity to speak them in a loving and winsome manner to others.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things that we can work on as the Reformed kind of broader community would be simply piety, and it must begin with ourselves. And I would just say, last night I was thinking deeply and praying about my piety, and I think piety means so much. So I would encourage people. What can we learn, I suppose, from Jean-Alphonse Turton, as we can see from his father Francis, his uncle Benedict, who he totally, or not his uncle, his cousin Benedict, sorry, totally contradicts their lead, and rather he goes down a path of compromise. And I would encourage Christians to hold fast to the old paths, but also I think we need to speak the truth in love. Now, I don't think that speaking the truth in love was really a factor in kind of the great decline of Geneva or the Swiss Reformed Church, but I do think that that's something we as a Reformed Church can do better. And I think we also are in a context in the Western world, Canada, the United States, even Western Europe, where people in our generation, as millennials, are just more sensitive, and therefore I think there's a growing need, or not a growing need, but a very relevant and prevalent need to be winsome but honest, and also when times get hard, willing to stand your ground. Um, and so I hope that that's what we will do. And on another broad kind of area is, and I think this is where kind of the direct application of Turretin's son comes in. We need not to be taken up in vain philosophy. Of course, the apostle speaks of that in Colossians. We need to be very careful with our methods of logic, reasoning, philosophy. We need to make sure that we don't give man more than he is. We don't give man more credit than he is due, and we, do things with fear and trembling, out of a love to God, and out of an obedience to Him that is given with a new heart. And therefore, I would say that Turretin's son teaches us the lesson to be careful. To really, I think, kind of Paul in Colossians 3, he says, if you then be risen with Christ, seek those things that are above. And I think that's a lesson we can definitely learn. Is Jean-Alphonse Turretin, he was seeking earthly unity of churches. He was incorporating new philosophical ideas, and he wasn't seeking things that are above. So that's my exhortation: is Christians, guard the truth carefully. Seek those things which are above. When you speak about the truth, do it winsomely and lovingly, politely and caringly, and ultimately, do not compromise for the sake of perceived unity or perceived gain in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I 100% agree with all those application points. And, I really think we could even use a follow-up to this episode to discuss, in a sense, one of the antidotes to this son of Turretin theology is just the importance of confessionalism and how those protect us from a lot of errors. And it's in their strictness that we are guarded in a lot of ways. And so I think that'd be fun to discuss a lot of the different confessions in the Reformation, not just Westminster, but the three forms of unity, perhaps the Second Helvetic Confession, and discuss how when we hold fast to truths that we've obtained as God's worked in history, that we are protected from this latitudinarian and inevitable liberalism that arises.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I suppose until next time, where we discuss the importance of confessions.
If that's what we end up agreeing to do, but sounds good to me.
Yeah, we'll see. We could do, maybe a little bit more on the exact theology of Turretin's son, and then break down what his issue with the formula consensus was, and then segue into the importance of confessions.
Yeah, perhaps so. Yeah, this has been fun though, Zach. Do you agree?
Yeah. It's been great. Thanks.
Yeah, and thanks to all our listeners that tuned in. I hope you learned something. I hope that it was a blessing to you. And stay tuned as we hopefully bring more forthcoming episodes with some of the lesser known elements of Reformation history and theology and the application to us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.